The brass numbers above the elevator doors flickered once, twice, then went completely dark. Victoria Chen pressed the emergency button again, harder this time, her manicured finger leaving a slight smudge on the polished metal. The silence that followed was deafening, no mechanical hum, no gentle whoosh of cables, nothing but the sound of her own increasingly shallow breathing echoing in the confined space. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She checked her phone. No signal. Of course there wouldn't be, not 42 floors up in the steel and glass tower that housed Meridian Industries corporate headquarters. The same building where she'd climbed from junior analyst to chief executive officer in just 12 years, where she'd made decisions that affected thousands of employees, where she'd earned the nickname the Iron Lady for her unwavering composure under pressure. But right now, trapped between the 41st and 42nd floors, with the lights dimming and the air growing thick, Victoria Chen didn't feel like iron. She felt like a 38-year-old woman who'd skipped lunch again, who'd been running on caffeine and sheer determination for the past 6 months, and who suddenly realized she might not make it to her sister's wedding tomorrow after all. The elevator shuddered once, a metallic groan that seemed to come from deep within the building's bones, and then settled into an ominous stillness. Victoria's reflection stared back at her from the polished steel door's power suit immaculate. Dark hair pulled back in its signature chignon, expression carefully controlled even now. She'd perfected that look over years of boardroom battles, hostile takeovers, and crisis management. Never let them see you sweat, her mentor had told her. Never let them see you break. But there was no one here to see her now. The first hour passed in a blur of methodical problem-solving. Victoria had always been a woman of action, someone who faced challenges head-on with spreadsheets and strategic planning. She pressed every button on the elevator panel multiple times, tested the emergency phone that produced only static, and even tried prying at the doors with her hands until her fingernails broke and her palms were scraped raw. She called out repeatedly, her voice growing hoarse as it bounced off the walls and returned to her unanswered. The building's security system should have detected the malfunction by now. Someone should have noticed that the CEO's elevator had stopped moving. But as the minutes ticked by with no response, no reassuring voice from the building's control room, Victoria began to realize that something was very wrong. Her phone showed 3:47 p.m. The building evacuation drill was scheduled for 4 p.m., the quarterly safety exercise that she'd signed off on but never participated in because she always had more important things to do. The irony wasn't lost on her. While everyone else was practicing emergency procedures, she was living through a real emergency, alone and unheard. The elevator car was spacious as corporate elevators went, with mirrors on 3 sides and a small bench seat that she'd never noticed before. She'd ridden this elevator thousands of times, usually checking emails or reviewing reports, always in motion even when she was standing still. Now forced into absolute stillness, she became acutely aware of every detail, the subtle pattern in the carpet, the way the LED lights cast shadows in the corners, the faint scent of cleaning products mixed with the lingering fragrance of expensive cologne from some earlier passenger. As the second hour began, Victoria allowed herself to sit on the bench for the first time. Her feet were beginning to ache in the 4-inch heels she'd worn to intimidate the board members during the morning's budget meeting. The meeting that now seemed like it had happened days ago instead of hours. She'd been so focused on the quarterly projections, so determined to prove that her aggressive expansion strategy was working, that she'd barely registered the janitor's comment about the elevator maintenance being delayed. The janitor, what was his name? Robert something. She'd seen him countless times over the years, always nodding politely when their paths crossed, but she'd never actually spoken to him beyond the occasional good morning. He was one of those invisible people who kept the building running while she and her colleagues focused on the big picture, the quarterly reports, the stock prices that determined bonuses and career trajectories. Victoria's stomach rumbled, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet space. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal. Breakfast had been a protein bar consumed between conference calls, and she'd planned to grab something after the 5 p.m. meeting with the Japanese investors. The meeting that she was now going to miss, along with the dinner with her sister to discuss wedding details, and the early morning flight to Seattle where she was supposed to give the maid of honor speech at the rehearsal dinner. Her sister, Emma, had been so excited about the wedding, calling every few days with updates about flowers and music and seating arrangements. Victoria had listened with half an ear, multitasking through most of the conversations, making appropriate responses, while reviewing contracts or approving budget allocations. She'd promised to be there, promised to put work aside for once and just be a sister. But even as she'd made those promises, she'd been mentally calculating how much work she could accomplish on the flight, how quickly she could return to handle the Henderson acquisition that was supposed to close next week. The third hour brought a different kind of awareness. The air in the elevator was definitely getting thinner, or maybe it was just her imagination. Victoria had always been claustrophobic, though she'd never admitted it to anyone. It was one of those weaknesses that successful women couldn't afford to have, like admitting you were afraid of public speaking, or that you sometimes cried in the bathroom after particularly brutal meetings. She found herself taking deliberate, measured breaths, the way she'd learned in the yoga classes she'd attended, exactly 3 times before deciding she was too busy for such luxuries. The breathing exercises felt silly then, but now they were. The only thing standing between her and the panic that threatened to rise up from her chest like a tide. It was during one of these breathing exercises that she heard it, a faint voice, so quiet she almost dismissed it as her imagination. But there it was again, coming from somewhere above her, filtered through the building's ventilation system or perhaps through the elevator shaft itself. A man's voice, calm and patient, speaking in gentle tones. Victoria stood up so quickly that her head spun. She pressed her ear to the ceiling, trying to locate the source of the sound. The voice was clearer now, though she couldn't make out the words. Someone was talking, maybe to a child, because there was that particular cadence that adults use when they were explaining something complex to a young mind. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Can you hear me? I'm trapped in the elevator." The voice stopped abruptly, and Victoria held her breath, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, voice returned, stronger now, more focused. "Ma'am, are you okay? Can you hear me clearly?" Relief flooded through her so intensely that she had to sit down again. Someone had heard her. Someone knew she was there. "Yes," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can hear you. I'm trapped in the elevator between floors. I think it's the 41st and 42nd floors." "Okay, stay calm. My name is David. I'm going to help you through this. First, are you hurt? Are you having any trouble breathing?" David. The name sounded solid, trustworthy. Victoria pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm not hurt," she said. "But I'm scared. I've been in here for about 3 hours now, and no one seems to know I'm missing." 3 hours? David's voice carried a note of concern. "That's a long time. But you're not alone now, okay? I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The simple statement hit her harder than it should have. When was the last time someone had promised not to leave her? When was the last time someone had prioritized her well-being over their own schedule, their own obligations? "Where are you?" she asked. "How can you hear me?" "I'm in the apartment building next door," David replied. "The walls are thin, and I think there's some kind of acoustical connection through the ventilation systems. I heard you calling out, and I've been trying to get through to building security, but the phones are all busy. I think there's been some kind of citywide power issue. A citywide power issue. That would explain why no one had noticed her missing, why the building's safety systems hadn't kicked in. It also meant that rescue might be much further away than she'd hoped. "What's your name?" David asked, his voice gentle but focused. "Victoria," she said, then hesitated. She'd spent so many years being Ms. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chen, or CEO Chen, or simply the boss that her first name felt strange on her tongue. Victoria Chen. Victoria, that's a beautiful name. Are you comfortable? Do you have water with you? She looked around the elevator, taking inventory for the first time. Her purse contained the usual items: phone, wallet, keys, emergency mints, a travel pack of tissues. No water, no snacks, nothing useful for survival. "No water," she admitted. "Just whatever's in my purse." "Okay, we'll work with that." The good news is that elevators are designed to be safe, even during extended outages. The air circulation system should still be working on emergency power, so you're not going to run out of air. But I want you to try to stay calm and conserve your energy. Victoria found herself nodding, even though David couldn't see her. There was something about his voice that was inherently calming, a steady confidence that didn't feel forced or artificial. It reminded her of her father, who'd been a small-town doctor before his death 5 years ago. He'd had that same ability to make people feel safe just by being present, just by speaking with quiet authority. "David," she said, "what time is it?" "It's 6:15 p.m. Are you supposed to be somewhere? Is someone expecting you?" The question opened a floodgate of realizations. Her assistant Julia would be wondering where she was, though Julia was probably dealing with her own emergency-related tasks. The Japanese investors would be waiting in the conference room, or maybe they'd already left. Emma would be expecting her call about the wedding details, and the airline would be holding her seat on the red-eye flight to Seattle. "I'm supposed to be in a lot of places," Victoria said, surprised by how hollow her own voice sounded. "I'm supposed to be everywhere except here." "Tell me about it," David said, and she could hear genuine interest in his voice. "Sometimes talking helps pass the time." Victoria leaned back against the elevator wall, feeling the cool metal through her silk blouse. When was the last time someone had asked her to talk about herself? Not about quarterly projections or strategic initiatives or market forecasts, but about herself? "I'm supposed to be in a board meeting right now," she began slowly, "with investors from Tokyo who flew in specifically to meet with me. I've been working on this deal for 8 months, and if it goes through, it'll be the largest acquisition in our company's history." "That sounds important," David said, without a trace of judgment in his voice. "It is important," Victoria insisted. Then paused. "At least it was important this morning. Now I'm not sure anything is important except getting out of here." "What else were you supposed to be doing?" Victoria closed her eyes, mentally reviewing her schedule. "I was supposed to call my sister about her wedding. She's getting married tomorrow, and I'm the maid of honor. I was supposed to fly to Seattle tonight for the rehearsal dinner." "Your sister's wedding," David repeated thoughtfully. "That's a big deal. Are you close?" The question caught Victoria off guard. Were they close? They'd been close as children, before Victoria had thrown herself into her career with single-minded determination. Before she'd started measuring her worth in stock options and corner offices instead of shared secrets and inside jokes. "We used to be," she said quietly, "before I got so busy that I forgot how to be a sister instead of just a CEO." "It's not too late," David said simply. "Sisters are sisters forever, even when life gets complicated." Victoria felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "Do you have siblings?" I have a younger brother, David replied. We don't talk as much as we should, but he's still my brother. And I have a daughter who's 7 years old. She's the reason I'm home right now instead of at work. A daughter. Victoria tried to picture this man she'd never seen, this stranger who was becoming her lifeline. Someone who prioritized being home with his child over whatever work obligations he might have. What's her name? Victoria asked. Sophie, David said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. She's probably wondering why I'm talking to the wall instead of helping her with her homework. Sophie, Victoria repeated. That's a lovely name. Is she your only child? Yes, just me and Sophie. Her mom passed away 2 years ago, so it's then just the two of us figuring things out together. The simple statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. This man, this stranger who was taking time out of his evening to talk to her, was a widowed father dealing with his own grief while raising a 7-year-old daughter alone. And instead of focusing on his own problems, he was here, talking her through her panic, offering comfort to someone he'd never met. David, I'm so sorry, she said, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. Thank you, he replied quietly. It's been hard, but Sophie and I are doing okay. She's stronger than I am most days. Victoria found herself thinking about strength, about what it really meant to be strong. She'd always defined strength as not needing anyone, as being able to handle everything alone, as never showing weakness or vulnerability. But David's strength seemed different. It was the strength to be present for someone else, to offer comfort even when you were dealing with your own pain. Victoria, David said, breaking into her thoughts, I want you to do something for me. I want you to find a comfortable position and try to relax. I know that's easier said than done, but I'm going to stay here and talk with you for as long as you need me to. You don't have to do that, Victoria protested automatically. I'm sure you have things to do, and Sophie needs you. Sophie's fine, David said firmly. She's doing her homework at the kitchen table, and she knows I'm helping someone who needs help. That's what we do in our family. We help people when they need it. Victoria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. When was the last time someone had helped her just because she needed help? When was the last time someone had put her needs ahead of their own schedule? Thank you, she whispered. You don't need to thank me, David said. Just try to get comfortable. We're going to get through this together. Victoria slipped off her heels and tucked her feet under her on the bench. The elevator felt less like a trap and more like a small room now, a space where she could breathe and think and maybe, for the first time in years, just be herself without having to perform or achieve or prove anything to anyone. David, she said, can you tell me about Sophie? What's she like? She's amazing, David said, and Victoria could hear the pride in his voice. She's got this incredible imagination, and she's always asking questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Why do people have to work? Why can't we have ice cream? For breakfast, she keeps me on my toes. She sounds wonderful, Victoria said, and realized she meant it. When was the last time she'd spent time with a child, or even thought about what children were like? Her friends from college had all started families years ago, but she'd gradually lost touch with them as her career consumed more and more of her time. She is wonderful, David agreed. She's also stubborn as a mule and has a tendency to leave. Her socks everywhere except in the hamper, but that's 7-year-olds for you. Victoria found herself smiling for the first time in hours. What does she want to be when she grows up? This week, she wants to be a marine biologist, David said with a chuckle. Last week it was a professional soccer player, and the week before that, she wanted to be a chef who specializes in desserts made entirely of candy. A candy chef sounds like a pretty good career choice, Victoria said, surprised by how natural it felt to joke with this stranger. I told her she should probably have a backup plan, David said. But honestly, I hope she never loses that sense of possibility, that feeling that she can be anything she wants to be. Victoria thought about her own childhood dreams, the ones she'd abandoned in favor of more practical pursuits. She'd wanted to be a writer once, or maybe a teacher. She'd loved books and stories, and the idea of helping people learn new things. But somewhere along the way, she'd decided that success meant climbing corporate ladders and maximizing shareholder value. "What did you want to be when you were 7? David asked, as if he could read her thoughts. "A librarian," Victoria said without hesitation, then laughed at herself. "I know that sounds boring, but I loved books. I loved the idea of being surrounded by all those stories, helping people find exactly what they were looking for." "That doesn't sound boring at all," David said warmly. "That sounds like someone who wanted to take care of people and help them discover new worlds." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of some tight knot she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "I haven't thought about that in years," she admitted. "Sometimes we need to get stuck in an elevator to remember who we used to be," David said gently. They fell into a comfortable silence, and Victoria found herself listening to the sounds of the building around her. There were faint voices from other floors, the distant hum of emergency generators, the subtle creaking of the building settling. She'd worked in this building for 12 years, but she'd never really heard it before. "David," she said after a while, "what do you do for work?" "I'm a paramedic," he replied. "I work for the city's emergency medical services. I've been doing it for about 10 years now, a paramedic." "Of course." That explained the calm competence in his voice, the way he'd immediately taken charge of the situation and focused on her well-being. He was trained to help people in crisis, to stay calm under pressure, to be the steady voice that guided people through their worst moments. "Is that how you know so much about staying calm in emergencies?" she asked. "Partly," David said. "But mostly it's from being a single parent. You learn to stay calm when your 7-year-old daughter is screaming because she can't find her favorite stuffed animal, or when she falls off her bike and scrapes her knee, or when she wakes up from a nightmare and needs you to convince her that monsters aren't real." "Monsters aren't real," Victoria repeated softly. "Well, not the kind that hide under beds," David said. "The real monsters are usually things like loneliness and fear and feeling like you're not good enough. But the good news is that those monsters can't hurt you when you're not facing them alone." Victoria felt those words settle deep in her chest. She'd been fighting monsters for so long, the fear of failure, the terror of not being strong enough, the constant pressure to prove herself over and over again. But she'd been fighting them alone, building walls around herself until she was isolated in a tower of her own making. "David," she said, "I need to tell you something. I think I've been hiding in this elevator for a lot longer than 3 hours." "What do you mean?" Victoria looked around the small space, seeing it clearly for the first time. The mirrored walls reflected her image back at her from every angle, but she'd been avoiding looking at herself for so long that she'd forgotten what she actually looked like when she wasn't performing. "I mean, I've been hiding from real life for years," she said slowly. "I've been so busy building a career that I forgot to build a life. I've been so focused on being successful that I forgot to be happy. And now?" David asked gently. "Now I'm trapped in an elevator, talking to a stranger who's shown me more kindness in the past hour than I've shown myself in years," Victoria said. "And somehow, this feels more real than anything I've done in a long time." "Victoria," David sighed, his voice warm and steady. "You're not trapped. You're just taking a break from running." Outside the elevator, the city hummed with its usual evening energy. Traffic moved through the streets below. People hurried home from work. Families gathered around dinner tables. But inside the small space between floors, time seemed to move differently. Victoria found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, the rhythm of simply being present, of having a conversation for its own sake, of connecting with another human being without agenda or strategy. "Can I ask you something?" she said to David. Of course. How do you do it? How do you balance being a paramedic and being a single father? Those are both huge responsibilities. David was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could hear the sound of papers rustling, probably Sophie working on her homework in the background. Honestly? David said finally, most days I feel like I'm failing at both. I miss Sophie's school events because I'm working, and I worry about my patients when I'm home with her. But I've learned that balance isn't about being perfect at everything. It's about being present wherever you are. Being present, Victoria repeated, testing the words. I don't think I know how to do that anymore. You're doing it right now, David pointed out. You're here, in this moment, talking to me. You're not checking your phone or thinking about your next meeting. You're just being Victoria. Victoria looked down at her phone, which had been silent for the past hour. Usually, the lack of notifications would have sent her into a panic, but now, it felt almost liberating. For the first time in years, she wasn't available to everyone else's needs and demands. She was just available to herself. David, she said, I have a confession to make. I'm listening. I've never had a conversation like this with anyone. Not even with my sister, not even with my closest friends. I don't think I have any close friends anymore. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that Victoria wasn't used to being. Why do you think that is? David asked, without judgment. Victoria considered the question seriously. I think I got so good at being the person everyone needed me to be, the decisive CEO, the successful executive, the woman who had it all figured out, that I forgot how to be the person I actually am. And who was that person? Victoria closed her eyes, trying to remember. I used to be someone who laughed more. Someone who asked questions because she was curious, not because she was trying to corner someone in a negotiation. Someone who had time for long conversations and spontaneous adventures and lazy Sunday mornings. That person is still there, David said gently. She's just been working very hard for a very long time. Victoria felt tears sliding down her cheeks, and for once, she didn't try to stop them. I'm tired, David. I'm so tired of being strong all the time. Then don't be strong right now, he said simply. Just be tired. Just be scared. Just be human. The permission to be human felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. Victoria let herself sink deeper into the bench, let her shoulders relax, let her carefully constructed facade crumble away piece by piece. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared of being trapped, but I'm also scared of what happens when I get out. I'm scared that I've built a life that doesn't actually fit who I am. Fear is just information, David said. It's telling you that something needs to change. But what if I don't know how to change? What if I've forgotten how to be anything other than what I am now? Then you learn, David said simply. You take it one day at a time, one choice at a time. You remember that you're not just a CEO, you're Victoria, who wanted to be a librarian when she was 7. Who has a sister getting married tomorrow, who's brave enough to admit when she's scared. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup but not caring. How did you get so wise? I'm not wise, David said with a laugh. I'm just a guy who's learned that the most important conversations happen when you're not trying to impress anyone. Well, I'm definitely not trying to impress you, Victoria said, gesturing to her disheveled appearance that no one could see. Good, David said warmly. Because the Victoria I'm talking to right now is pretty impressive all on her own. Victoria felt something warm spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long. She'd almost forgotten what it was like. Acceptance, not for what she'd accomplished or achieved, but for who she was in this moment, scared and tired and human. David, she said, can I tell you about my sister's wedding? I'd love to hear about it. And so Victoria began to talk, really talk, about Emma and her fiancé Marcus, about the small beach ceremony they'd planned, about the dress Emma had. chosen and the flowers she'd picked and the vows she'd written herself. She talked about how proud she was of her sister and how guilty she felt for being so absent during the planning process. As she spoke, David listened with the kind of attention that Victoria had forgotten existed, not the performance of listening while waiting for your turn to speak, but the real thing, the gift of complete presence. He asked follow-up questions, laughed at her stories, and shared his own experiences of watching people he cared reach important milestones. The conversation flowed like water, natural and easy, touching on everything from family dynamics to career pressures to the challenge of maintaining relationships when work demanded so much time and energy. Victoria found herself sharing stories she hadn't thought about in years, remembering parts of herself she'd left behind in the pursuit of success. "You know what's funny?" she said as the conversation wound through its third hour. "I've been in hundreds of business meetings, given countless presentations, negotiated deals worth millions of dollars. But I can't remember the last time I had a conversation that mattered as much as this one. Why do you think that is?" David asked. Victoria considered the question. "Because this is the first conversation I've had in years where I didn't have to be anything other than myself. I didn't have to sell anything or prove anything or win anything. I could just be honest." "Honesty is underrated," David said. "It's also harder than it looks." "It is hard," Victoria agreed, "but it's also kind of liberating. I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years, even trapped in an elevator." Victoria looked around the small space that had become her refuge, her confessional, her sanctuary. "Especially trapped in an elevator. It's like the universe forced me to stop running and actually look at my life." "And what do you see?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, really considering the question. "I see a woman who's been so busy climbing the ladder that she forgot to look around and see if the ladder was leaning against the right wall." "So what wall do you want to lean it against?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Victoria had spent so many years defining success in terms of external metrics, salary, title, market share, quarterly growth. But sitting in the elevator, talking to David, she began to imagine different measures of success: time for relationships, space for creativity, the ability to be fully present in her own life. "I want to lean it against a wall that leads to a life I actually want to live," she said finally. "Not the life I think I'm supposed to want, but the life that would make me happy." "That sounds like a good place to start," David said gently. Victoria settled back against the elevator wall, feeling more at peace than she had in years. She was still trapped, still uncertain about when rescue would come, but somehow that felt less important now. The real rescue had already begun, in the form of a stranger's voice and the radical act of honest conversation. For the first time in years, Victoria Chen was exactly where she needed to be. The digital clock on Victoria's phone read 9:23 p.m. when she heard Sophie's voice for the first time. It was distant and muffled, filtering through the same mysterious acoustic connection that had brought David into her world, but unmistakably, the voice of a child. "Daddy, can you help me with this math problem? I don't understand why 7 times 8 has to equal 56. Why can't it equal 60? Victoria found herself smiling despite everything. There was something refreshingly logical about a 7-year-old questioning the fundamental rules of mathematics. "Hold on just a second, sweetheart." David's voice came through, closer and clearer than Sophie's had been. "I'm talking to someone. Who needs help right now?" "Is it someone from work?" Sophie asked, and Victoria could hear the slight edge in the child's voice that suggested this wasn't the first time work had interrupted their evening routine. "No, honey, it's someone who's stuck and she's scared. Remember how you felt when you got lost in the grocery store last month?" There was a pause, and then Sophie's voice came through again, softer now. "Is she crying?" Victoria touched her face, realizing that tears had been sliding down her cheeks intermittently for the past hour. She'd stopped trying to control them, stopped worrying about maintaining her composure. "Victoria," David said gently, "Sophie wants to know if you're okay." The simple concern in a child's question hit Victoria harder than any board meeting criticism ever had. When was the last time someone had asked if she was okay and actually wanted to hear the honest answer? "Tell Sophie that I'm okay now," Victoria called out, raising her voice so the little girl might be able to hear her. "Tell her that her daddy is helping me feel much better." She heard Sophie's delighted gasp, followed by rapid footsteps. "Daddy, I can hear her. Is she really stuck in an elevator? Can we help her get out?" "We're helping her by keeping her company," David explained patiently. "Sometimes that's the most important kind of help." Victoria pressed her hand to her chest, feeling something unfamiliar stir in there. She'd built her career on solving problems with action, with decisive moves and strategic planning. The idea that simply being present could be helpful was foreign to her, yet here she was, experiencing exactly that kind of healing. "Sophie," Victoria called out, "what kind of math homework are you working on?" "Multiplication tables," came the reply, clearer now as if Sophie had moved closer to wherever David was positioned. "But I don't see why I need to memorize them when I can just use a calculator." Victoria laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her with its lightness. "You know what? I used to think the exact same thing when I was your age." "Really? What made you change your mind?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "Well, I learned that sometimes the tools we depend on don't work. Like right now, my phone doesn't have any signal, and all my fancy technology can't help me get out of this elevator. But the things I learned with my own brain, those are still there." "Oh," Sophie said thoughtfully. "So it's like having a backup plan in your head?" "Exactly like that," Victoria said, impressed by the child's quick understanding. "You're very smart, Sophie." "Thank you. Daddy says I get my brains from my mom, but my stubbornness from him." Victoria heard David chuckle in the background. "That's not exactly what I said, kiddo." "Close enough," Sophie replied with the confidence that only 7-year-olds could muster. As the evening progressed, Victoria found herself drawn into the rhythm of David and Sophie's household routine. She listened as David helped Sophie finish her homework, their conversation peppered with gentle corrections and patient explanations. She heard Sophie practicing piano scales, each note slightly off-key but played with enthusiasm. She listened to the sounds of dinner being prepared, dishes clinking, water running. It was like being given a window into a completely different way of living. Where Victoria's evenings were usually filled with conference calls and urgent emails, David's world seemed to revolve around homework help and bedtime stories. Where her apartment was silent, except for the hum of expensive appliances, their home was full of conversation and laughter and the comfortable chaos of daily life. "Victoria," David said after Sophie had gone to brush her teeth, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." The serious tone in his voice made Victoria sit up straighter. "What is it? How are you feeling physically? Any dizziness, nausea, shortness of breath?" Victoria took inventory of her body. She was definitely tired, and her stomach was growling with increasing insistence, but she felt more mentally clear than she had in months. "I'm hungry," she admitted, "and tired. But not sick tired, just emotionally drained tired." "That's normal," David said reassuringly. "What you're going through is incredibly stressful, even with someone to talk to. Your body is running on adrenaline, and that can be exhausting." Victoria shifted on the bench, trying to find a more comfortable position. "David, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. When Sophie's mom died, how did you manage? How did you keep going when everything fell apart?" David was quiet for so long that Victoria wondered if the connection had been lost. Then his voice came through, softer than before. "I didn't manage, not at first. For about 6 months, I barely functioned." Sophie would make herself cereal for breakfast because I couldn't get out of bed. I'd call in sick to work and then lie on the couch staring at the ceiling. I was drowning, and I was taking her down with me. Victoria's throat tightened. What? Changed? Sophie did, David said simply. One morning, she climbed into bed with me and said, "Daddy, I miss Mommy too, but I'm scared you're going to disappear like she did." That's when I realized that grief wasn't just something that was happening to me. It was something that was happening to us, and Sophie needed me to figure out how to carry it without letting it carry me away. How did you learn to do that? Therapy helped, a grief support group for single parents. But mostly, I learned by paying attention to what Sophie needed from me each day. She needed breakfast, so I learned to make pancakes. She needed help with homework, so I relearned third-grade math. She needed bedtime stories, so I started making them up. Victoria thought about her own relationship with need, how she'd spent years trying to minimize her own needs and avoid depending on anyone else. Weren't you angry? At the unfairness of it all. Every day, David said honestly. I was furious at cancer, at God, at the randomness of a universe that could take a 34-year-old mother away from her daughter. But anger is like grief. You can't make it go away by ignoring it. You have to feel it, process it, and then decide what you're going to do with the energy it creates. What did you do with yours? I decided to use it to become the kind of father Sophie deserved. Not perfect, but present. Not without struggles, but committed to working through them. And eventually, the anger transformed into something else. What? Gratitude, David said, and Victoria could hear the surprise in his own voice. Gratitude for the time we had with Rachel, for the fact that Sophie exists at all, for every ordinary moment we get to share together. Victoria felt tears welling up again, but these felt different from the earlier ones. These weren't tears of fear or self-pity, but something deeper and more complex. I don't think I know how to feel gratitude anymore, she admitted. I used to when I was younger. But somewhere along the way, I started measuring my life by what I didn't have yet instead of appreciating what I did have. What don't you have that you thought you needed? The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of everything Victoria had been chasing for the past 15 years. Success, I guess, real success. The kind that means you never have to worry about anything ever again. And what does that look like? Victoria opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. She'd been working toward some abstract notion of enough for so long that she'd never actually defined what enough would look like. I don't know, she said finally. I thought if I made enough money, earned enough recognition, climbed high enough on the corporate ladder, I'd feel secure. But every goal I reach just reveals another goal beyond it. It's like chasing the horizon. What would happen if you stopped chasing it? The question made Victoria's chest tighten with anxiety. I don't know. I've never stopped. I don't know who I am when I'm not working towards something. Maybe that's what you're doing right now, David suggested gently. Maybe this is your chance to find out who Victoria is when she's not performing, not achieving, not proving anything to anyone. Before Victoria could respond, Sophie's voice chimed in from the background. Daddy, I'm ready for my story. I'll be right there, sweetheart, David called back. Then, to Victoria, I need to put Sophie to bed, but I'll be back in about 20 minutes. Will you be okay? The prospect of being alone again, even for 20 minutes, made Victoria's stomach clench with anxiety. But she heard herself saying, "Of course, take care of Sophie." Victoria, David said, I want you to try something while I'm gone. Close your eyes and just listen. Don't try to solve anything or plan anything. Just listen to the building around you, to your own breathing, to whatever comes up. Sometimes we hear things in silence that we miss in all the noise. After David's voice faded away, Victoria found herself truly alone for the first time since their conversation had begun. The silence felt different, now not oppressive but spacious. She could hear the distant hum of the building's emergency systems, the faint sound of traffic far below, the whisper of air moving through the ventilation system. She closed her eyes as David had suggested and tried to listen, really listen. At first, her mind raced with its usual litany of concerns, the missed meetings, the delayed deals, the mounting crisis that her absence was surely creating. But gradually, as she focused on her breathing, the mental chatter began to quiet. In the silence, other things emerged. She became aware of the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders for months, the headache that had become so constant she'd stopped noticing it, the hollow feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with missing dinner. Her body was trying to tell her something it had been trying to tell her for years. Slow down, rest, pay attention. Victoria thought about what David had said about anger transforming into gratitude. She tried to imagine what her own anger might transform into if she let herself feel it fully instead of pushing it down in service of productivity and professional success. She was angry, she realized. Angry at herself for letting work consume her life. Angry at the corporate culture that rewarded dysfunction and called it dedication. Angry at the voice in her head that never let her rest, never let her feel satisfied with what she'd accomplished. But underneath the anger was something else. Sadness. Sadness for all the moments she'd missed, all the relationships she'd neglected, all the parts of herself she'd abandoned in pursuit of external validation. When David's voice returned, it felt like a gentle hand reaching into her solitude. "How are you doing, Victoria?" "I've been thinking," she said, her voice slightly hoarse from crying, "about anger and gratitude and all the things I've been too busy to feel. What came up for you?" "I realize that I've been angry at my life for a long time, but I've been directing that anger at the wrong target. I've been angry at myself for not being successful enough, when what I'm really angry about is that I let success become more important than happiness." "That's a big realization." "It is," Victoria agreed. "And I'm not sure what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it right now," David said gently. "Sometimes the most important work is just acknowledging what's true." They fell into another comfortable silence, and Victoria found herself thinking about Emma's wedding, about the maid of honor speech she was supposed to give tomorrow night. She'd been planning to talk about Emma's determination, her career success, her ability to balance everything perfectly. But now she wondered if that was really what mattered most about her sister. "David," she said suddenly, "I think I've been a terrible sister." "Why do you say that?" "Because I've been so focused on my own life, my own problems, that I haven't really been present for Emma. Even this wedding, I've been treating it like another item on my schedule instead of one of the most important days of her life. What would being a good sister look like?" Victoria considered the question, being excited for her instead of stressed about the logistics, asking her how she's feeling instead of just confirming the timeline, actually listening when she talks about her hopes and dreams instead of mentally reviewing my email while she's talking. "It sounds like you know exactly what being a good sister looks like," David observed. "I do know," Victoria said with surprise. "I just haven't been doing it." "Why do you think that is?" Victoria thought about all the reasons she'd been giving herself for years. Too busy, too many responsibilities, not enough time. But sitting in the elevator, those excuses felt hollow. "Because I've been scared," she admitted. "Scared that if I let myself care too much about anything other than work, I'll lose my edge. Scared that if I'm not completely focused on my career, I'll fall behind, fail, disappoint everyone." "Who would you disappoint?" The question stopped Victoria cold. Who would she disappoint? Her board of directors, certainly, but they were essentially strangers who judged her solely on quarterly performance. Her competitors who would be happy to see her fail. Her father, who had died 5 years ago after telling her repeatedly that he was proud of the woman she'd become, not the executive she'd become. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I think I've been so afraid of disappointing." Some imaginary audience that I've ended up disappointing the people who actually matter. Like Emma? Like Emma. Like myself. Victoria heard Sophie's sleepy voice in the background, calling for water, and listened as David patiently got up to help her. The easy tenderness in his voice as he talked to his daughter made Victoria's chest ache with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't envy exactly, but a recognition of something she'd been missing without realizing it. When David returned, Victoria said, "Can I tell you something that might sound crazy?" "Nothing sounds crazy after the day we've both had." "I think this might be the best conversation I've had in years," Victoria said. "And it's happening while I'm trapped in an elevator, talking to someone I've never met, missing the most important business meeting of my career." "Why do you think that is?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "Because for the first time in forever, I'm not trying to manage the conversation or control the outcome. I'm not trying to impress you or convince you of anything. I'm just talking honestly about things that actually matter." "How does that feel?" "Terrifying," Victoria said with a laugh. "And also wonderful. Like I've been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale." "What would happen if you talked to other people in your life this way?" The question opened up a vista of possibilities that both excited and frightened Victoria. What if she talked to Emma this way, openly and honestly about their relationship, instead of just coordinating schedules? What if she talked to her employees this way, acknowledging the human cost of their high-pressure work environment instead of just pushing for better results? What if she talked to herself this way, with compassion instead of constant criticism? "I think my whole life would change," Victoria said softly. "Is that what you want? For your whole life to change?" Victoria looked around the small elevator, space that had become her cocoon, her transformation chamber. 6 hours ago, the idea of her life changing would have sent her into a panic. Now, the idea of her life staying the same felt far more frightening. "Yes," she said with certainty. That surprised her. "I want my life to change. I want to remember how to be happy. I want to have relationships that matter more than stock options. I want to be the kind of person who shows up for the people she loves, not just the meetings she scheduled." "Those are beautiful wants," David said warmly. "They're also scary wants," Victoria admitted. "Because wanting them means admitting that the life I've built isn't the life I actually want to live." "Change is scary," David agreed. "But staying stuck in a life that doesn't fit you is scarier." Victoria thought about that, about the different kinds of being stuck. She'd thought she was stuck in the elevator, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. But now she realized she'd been stuck in her own life for much longer, trapped by choices she'd made and kept making out of habit and fear. "David," she said, "when you decided to change after Rachel died, how did you know where to start?" "I started with the next right thing," David said simply. "I couldn't figure out how to rebuild my whole life, but I could figure out how to make Sophie breakfast. I couldn't process all my grief at once, but I could get through one day. And then, one day became a week, and a week became a month." "The next right thing," Victoria repeated, testing the concept. "I've been so focused on long-term strategic planning that I'd forgotten about the next right thing. What feels like the next right thing for you?" Victoria closed her eyes, checking in with herself in a way she rarely did. "Calling Emma," she said without hesitation. "Not about wedding logistics or travel arrangements, but just to tell her I love her and I'm proud of her and I'm sorry I've been such a distracted sister. That sounds like a beautiful next right thing. If I ever get out of here," Victoria added with a wry smile that David couldn't see but could probably hear in her voice. "You will get out of here," David said firmly. "And when you do, you'll have a choice about what kind of life you want to walk back into." Victoria felt the truth of that statement settle into her bones. She would get out of the elevator eventually. But the question was whether she would walk back into her old life or have the courage to build a new one. "David," she said. "I know this might sound strange, but I'm actually grateful this happened tonight." "Why?" "Because otherwise I might have gone my whole life without realizing that I was living the wrong life. I might have been successful and miserable and never understood why. And now I know that success without happiness is just an expensive way to be empty," Victoria said. "And I know that the most important conversations happen when you're not trying to impress anyone." They talked for another hour, their conversation meandering through topics both profound and mundane. David told her about Sophie's latest art project, a painting of their apartment building that she'd been working on for weeks. Victoria found herself sharing memories of her childhood with Emma before their parents' divorce had split them into different households and different worlds. As the clock approached midnight, Victoria realized that this single evening had been more emotionally honest and connected than most of her entire adult relationships. She'd learned more about herself in 6 hours of conversation with a stranger than she had in years of therapy sessions she'd been too busy to schedule. "Victoria," David said as Sophie's bedtime routine finally wound down, "I want you to know something." "What's that?" "Talking with you tonight has been a gift for me too. It's reminded me that there are other people out there who are trying to figure out how to live meaningful lives, who are brave enough to question whether they're on the right path." "I'm not sure brave is the right word," Victoria said. "I think desperate might be more accurate." "Sometimes desperation and bravery look a lot alike," David replied. "Sometimes it takes getting completely lost to realize you need to find a new direction." Victoria felt something shift inside her, a quiet but definitive change in the landscape of her heart. She was still trapped in an elevator, still facing an uncertain rescue timeline, still confronting the possibility that her absence had created professional chaos she'd have to clean up. But for the first time in years, those external concerns felt secondary to the internal work she was doing. She was excavating herself, dusting off parts of her personality that had been buried under years of performance and productivity. She was remembering what it felt like to be curious instead of calculating, vulnerable instead of invulnerable, human instead of merely functional. As the building settled into its late-night quiet around her, Victoria Chen prepared to face whatever came next with a radically different understanding of what actually mattered. The elevator had become her chrysalis, and she could feel something new beginning to unfold within her, something that looked a lot like the person she'd been before she'd forgotten how to be herself. At 1:47 a.m., Victoria's phone finally died. The screen went black with a soft electronic sigh, taking with it her last connection to the outside world beyond David's voice. She stared at the dark rectangle in her palm, feeling strangely liberated rather than panicked. For the first time in over a decade, she was completely unreachable, completely disconnected from the digital leash that had governed her every waking moment. "My phone just died," she announced into the darkness, and was surprised to hear herself laughing. "How does that feel?" David asked, his voice carrying the gentle curiosity that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past 10 hours. "Like I just took off shoes that were 3 sizes too small," Victoria replied, setting the dead device aside. "I should be terrified right now. My entire life is on that phone. But instead, I feel like I can finally think clearly." The elevator had grown cooler as the night progressed, and Victoria had long since wrapped herself in her suit jacket like a makeshift blanket. She'd given up any pretense of maintaining her professional appearance hours ago. Her hair had escaped its pristine bun and hung in loose waves around her shoulders. Her makeup had been cried off and wiped away with tissues. Her stockings had runs in them from shifting position on the bench countless times. She imagined, like exactly what she was, a woman who had been stripped down to her essential self, layer by careful layer. "Victoria," David said softly, "can I tell you something I've been thinking about while we've been talking? Of course, I keep wondering what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances. If you'd been the woman who lived next door, or someone I'd met at Sophie's school, or just another person standing in line at the coffee shop. Victoria felt her heart skip unexpectedly. What do you think would have happened? I think I would have been intimidated by you, David said honestly. The powerful CEO in the expensive suit, always checking her phone, always rushing somewhere important. I would have assumed we had nothing in common. And now? Now I know that this suit was just costume, and the rushing was just running away from something. Now I know that underneath all that armor is someone who thinks 7-year-olds questioning. Math makes perfect sense. Someone who wanted to be a librarian. Someone who's brave enough to admit when she's lost. Victoria felt tears welling up again, but these were different from all the others she'd shed tonight. These felt like relief, like recognition, like coming home to herself after a very long journey. David, she said, her voice barely above. A whisper. I think you're the first person in years who's seen me. Really seen me. Not my job title, or my bank account, or my professional reputation. Just me. What do you think that means? Victoria considered the question, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone. I think it means I've been hiding. For so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be known. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Victoria had ever experienced. It was as if the darkness and isolation had created a sacred space where truth became not only possible, but inevitable. She found herself telling David things she'd never told anyone, about the panic attacks she'd been having before board meetings, about the prescription sleep aids she'd been relying on for months, about the way she sometimes stood at her office window and fantasized about disappearing entirely. David listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped her dig deeper into her own understanding. He shared his own struggles too, the nights when grief still hit him like a freight train, the guilt he felt about sometimes being relieved that Rachel wasn't there to see him stumble through single parenthood, the fear that he wasn't enough. For Sophie, that he was failing her in ways he couldn't even recognize. Do you know what's strange? Victoria said as they talked through the darkest hours of the night. I've spent my entire career learning how to manage people, how to motivate them and direct them and get the best performance out of them. But I never learned how to have a real conversation with another human being. What's the difference? In a business conversation, you're always trying to get somewhere specific. You have an agenda, an outcome you're working toward. You're managing the other person's responses to achieve your goals. But this, Victoria gestured around the elevator, even though David couldn't see her. This is just two people being honest with each other. There's nowhere to get to accept deeper understanding. Which is scarier? David asked. This, Victoria answered immediately. Business conversations have rules and strategies and predictable patterns. This requires you to show up as yourself, and I'm realizing I'm not sure who that is anymore. What if you didn't have to figure it all out right now? What if you could just be curious about who you are instead of trying to define it? The suggestion felt revolutionary to Victoria, whose entire adult life had been built on 5-year plans and strategic objectives. The idea of approaching her own identity with curiosity rather than control was both terrifying and exhilarating. I don't know how to be curious about myself, she admitted. I know how to criticize myself, how to push myself, how to demand more from myself. But curiosity feels dangerous. Why dangerous? Victoria thought about it, tracing the pattern of her own resistance. Because if I start being curious about who I really am, I might discover that the life I've built is completely wrong for me. And then I'd have to do something about it. And doing something about it feels impossible. It feels like starting over from scratch, Victoria said. Like admitting that 15 years of my life have been a mistake. Or, David suggested gently, like admitting that 15 years of your life have been preparation for becoming who you're meant to be. The reframe hit Victoria like a physical force. She'd been thinking about her potential transformation as a rejection of everything she'd accomplished, a wholesale abandonment of her identity. But what if it was actually an integration? What if all the skills she'd developed, all the strength she'd built, all the lessons she'd learned could be channeled toward creating a life that actually fit her? "I've never thought about it that way," she said slowly. "What would it look like if you applied all your intelligence and determination and leadership skills to building a life you actually wanted instead of a life you thought you should want?" The question opened up possibilities that made Victoria's head spin. What if she used her business acumen to start something meaningful instead of just profitable? What if she applied her strategic thinking to designing a work-life balance that actually worked? What if she channeled her natural leadership abilities toward creating positive change instead of just increasing shareholder value? "It would look like a completely different life," she said, wonder creeping into her voice. "Different how?" Victoria closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. "I'd work with people instead of managing them. I'd have time for relationships that mattered. I'd probably live somewhere I could see trees from my window instead of just more buildings. I'd remember what I used to love before I got so focused on what I was supposed to achieve." "What did you used to love?" The question sent Victoria's mind spiraling backward through years of forgotten passions. "I loved reading. Not just business books and industry reports, but novels and poetry and biographies of interesting people. I loved cooking complicated meals that took all afternoon to prepare. I loved hiking and being outside. I loved long conversations about ideas and dreams and what makes life meaningful." "When did you stop doing those things?" "Gradually," Victoria said sadly. "A little bit at a time, as work consumed more and more of my life. I told myself I'd get back to them when I reached the next level, when things calmed down, when I had more time. But there was always another level, things never calmed down, and I never made time." "What if you started making time now?" "Now?" Victoria laughed, gesturing around the elevator. "I'm literally trapped in a metal box." "You're trapped physically," David agreed. "But mentally, emotionally, you're freer than you've been in years. You've remembered who you are underneath all the professional obligations. You've reconnected with what actually matters to you." "That's not nothing, Victoria. That's everything." As the night wore on, Victoria found herself examining her life with a clarity she'd never had before. The elevator had become a kind of sensory deprivation chamber, stripping away all the external distractions and demands that usually occupied her attention. Without meetings to attend or emails to answer or crises to manage, she was finally able to hear her own thoughts, feel her own feelings, acknowledge her own needs. And what she discovered wasn't pretty. She realized that she'd been running on empty for months, maybe years. That the anxiety she'd been medicating with work and wine and shopping was actually her soul's way of trying to get her attention. That the loneliness she'd been ignoring was real and devastating and getting worse with every relationship she neglected in favor of professional advancement. "David," she said during one of the quiet moments when they were both just breathing in the darkness, "I think I've been living someone else's life." "Whose life?" "I don't know," Victoria said, frustrated by her own confusion. "Maybe some composite version of what I thought a successful woman was supposed to look like. Maybe my father's dreams for me, or society's expectations, or just the logical extension of being good at business school." "But not your life?" "No," Victoria said with certainty that surprised her. "Not my life. My life would have more laughter in it. More time for people I care about. More space for creativity and growth. And the kind of work that feels meaningful instead of just profitable." "What does meaningful work look like to you?" Victoria had to think about that. She'd been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that she'd never really considered whether the ladder was leaning against a wall she actually wanted to reach. "I think meaningful work would involve helping people," she said slowly. "Not just helping rich people get richer, but actually making a positive difference in the world. Maybe starting programs that help other women advance their careers without sacrificing their humanity. Maybe using business principles to solve social problems. Maybe creating workplaces where people can be successful without being miserable. Those sound like things you could do, David observed. They sound like things the old Victoria could do, she corrected. The one who wanted to be a librarian, who believed in helping people find what they were looking for. But I don't know. If I can get back to her. What if you don't have to get back to her? What if you can move forward as her? The distinction felt monumental to Victoria. She'd been thinking about change as a return to some previous version of herself. But David was suggesting something more complex and promising. Evolution rather than regression. Integration rather than replacement. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared that if I stop being the person I've trained myself to be, I won't know how to be anyone at all. Fear is just information, David said, echoing something he'd told her earlier. What is your fear telling? You that you need? Victoria sat with the question, really listening to her anxiety instead of trying to push it away. I think it's telling me that I need safety, security, some kind of guarantee that if I change my life, I won't lose everything that matters. What matters most to you right now in this moment? This conversation, Victoria said without hesitation. This connection. The feeling that someone understands me, that I'm not alone, that it's possible to be known and accepted for who I really am. And you think changing your external life would threaten that? Victoria realized with a start that the opposite was true. The connection she felt with David had emerged precisely because she'd stopped performing, stopped trying to be impressive, stopped hiding behind her professional persona. If anything, moving toward authenticity in her daily life would create more opportunities for this kind of real connection, not fewer. I think I've had it backwards, she said slowly. I think the life I've been living is what's been preventing me from having relationships like this one. How so? Because I've been so afraid of being vulnerable, so invested in appearing strong and capable and in control, that I've never given anyone the chance to see who I really am. And if people can't see who you really are, they can't really love. You. The word love hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and significance. Victoria realized that she hadn't used that word in a personal context in years. She'd told business associates she'd love to do deals with them. Told service providers she'd love for them to solve her problems. But when was the last time she'd talked about actual love? The kind that required vulnerability and risk and showing up as yourself. Victoria, David said softly, do you think you've been afraid of being loved? The question hit her like a lightning bolt. She'd always thought of herself as someone who was simply too busy for love, too focused on her career to prioritize relationships. But sitting in the darkness, she recognized a deeper truth. She'd been terrified that if someone really knew her, really saw her without all the professional accomplishments and external validation, they wouldn't find her worth loving. Yes, she whispered. I think I've been afraid that if someone saw the real me, they'd realize I'm not as impressive as I pretend to be. And what's the real you like? Victoria took inventory of herself in the darkness, trying to see herself through David's eyes rather than through the critical lens of her own self-judgment. The real me laughs at children's logic about math problems, she said. The real me cries when she's overwhelmed instead of just working harder. The real me wants to help people and make a difference and have conversations that matter more than stock prices. The real me is probably more interesting than the professional version, but also more fragile. Fragile isn't the same as weak. David pointed out, it feels the same to me. What if fragility is actually a sign of authenticity? What if the things that make you fragile are the same things that make you human, and being human is what allows you to connect with other people? Victoria thought about that, about the inverse relationship between self-protection and connection. Every wall she'd built to keep herself safe had also kept her isolated. Every mask she'd worn to appear strong had also hidden her from being truly known. "I think I've been living in a prison of my own making," she said. "And calling it success. What would freedom look like?" Victoria closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. Freedom would look like waking up excited about the day ahead instead of dreading it. It would look like having friends who know my middle name and my favorite color and what makes me laugh. It would look like work that feels meaningful instead of just demanding. It would look like having time for Emma's wedding to actually matter to me instead of just being another obligation to manage. "Those things all sound possible," David said gently. "Do they?" "I'm 38 years old, David. I'm not some recent college graduate who can just start over. I have responsibilities, obligations, people counting on me. What if starting over isn't about abandoning your responsibilities, but about approaching them differently? What if you could keep the parts of your life that actually serve you and change the parts that don't?" The suggestion felt both obvious and revolutionary. Victoria had been thinking in all-or-nothing terms, but life was more nuanced than that. She could probably negotiate for more flexibility in her work schedule. She could definitely prioritize relationships over networking. Events. She could certainly stop checking email at midnight and sleeping with her phone on the nightstand. "I think I've been making it more complicated than it needs to be," she admitted. "Change is usually simpler than we think and harder than we expect," David said. "Simple because most of it comes down to different choices. Hard because those choices require courage." "What kind of courage?" "The courage to disappoint people who have expectations of you. The courage to admit when something isn't working. The courage to want something different than what you're supposed to want." Victoria thought about the various people in her life who had invested in her current identity, the board members who valued her relentless drive, the employees who depended on her unwavering strength, the business partners who counted on her total availability. The idea of disappointing them felt almost unbearable. But then she thought about Emma, about the disappointment in her sister's voice every time Victoria had to reschedule their plans or cut their conversations short for work emergencies. She thought about disappointing herself day after day by living a life that felt increasingly hollow and meaningless. "I think I've been more afraid of disappointing strangers than of disappointing myself," she said. "What would happen if you flipped that around?" Victoria tried to imagine prioritizing her own needs and values over external expectations. It felt selfish at first, but as she sat with the idea, it began to feel more like self-preservation. "I think I'd probably make better decisions," she said slowly. "Decisions based on what actually matters instead of what looks impressive. What matters to you most?" "Relationship," Victoria said immediately. "Connection. Being useful in a way that actually helps people instead of just generating profit. Having time for beauty and creativity and the things that make life feel worth living. Those are beautiful priorities. They're also completely at odds with how I've been living, for now," David said. "But that can change. You can change it." As the night continued its slow progression toward dawn, Victoria felt something fundamental shifting inside her. It wasn't just a change of heart or a moment of inspiration that would fade with the morning light. It was a deep, structural transformation in how she understood herself and her life. She was beginning to see that the elevator hadn't trapped her, it had freed her. Freed her from the constant motion that had kept her from thinking clearly. Freed her from the digital distractions that had kept her from feeling deeply. Freed her from the performance of success that had kept her from examining whether she was actually happy. "David," she said as the first faint light began to filter through the small window at the top of the elevator, "I need to tell you something. I'm listening. I don't think I'm the same person I was when I got stuck in here yesterday afternoon." "How are you different?" Victoria searched for words to describe the transformation that felt as real and dramatic as a physical metamorphosis. Yesterday's Victoria was running away from herself so fast that she never had time to ask whether She liked where she was going. Today's Victoria is sitting still for the first time in years, and she's discovering that she doesn't like where she ended up. But more than that, she's discovering that it's not too late to choose a different destination. What destination are you choosing? Victoria felt a smile spread across her face, the first genuinely joyful expression she'd worn in months. I'm choosing a life that feels like home instead of a race, she said. I'm choosing relationships over achievements, meaning over money, presence over productivity. I'm choosing to be myself instead of who I think I should be. That sounds like a beautiful choice. It feels terrifying and liberating at the same time, Victoria admitted. Like jumping out of an airplane with a parachute you've never tested. But you're jumping towards something you actually want instead of away from something you're afraid of? Exactly, Victoria said, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. For the first time in my adult life, I'm moving towards something, instead of just climbing higher. As the elevator filled with the gray light of early morning, Victoria felt herself emerging from her chrysalis. She was still physically trapped, still waiting for rescue, still facing an uncertain future. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, she had never been more free. The woman who would eventually walk out of this elevator would be recognizably Victoria Chen, but she would also be someone entirely new, someone who had remembered how to be human, how to be vulnerable, how to choose love over fear and authenticity over performance. And it had all begun with a stranger's voice in the darkness, offering the radical gift of being truly seen and heard. The rescue team's voices echoed through the elevator shaft at 6:23 a.m., sharp and professional against the gentle morning light that had begun filtering through the small window. Victoria heard them before David did, their technical jargon and urgent communications creating a stark contrast to the intimate conversation that had sustained her through the night. "Ma'am, can you hear us? This is Captain Rodriguez with the fire department. We're going to get you out of there." Victoria pressed herself against the elevator doors, her heart suddenly racing with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Relief. Certainly, but also something that felt surprisingly like loss. "I can hear you," she called back, her voice hoarse from hours of conversation. "I'm okay. I'm not injured. Good. We need you to move to the back corner of the elevator, away from the doors. We're going to be using some heavy equipment, and there might be sparks." Victoria obediently moved to the far corner, but her attention was split between the rescue operation and David's voice, which had gone quiet since the firefighters arrived. "David," she said softly, knowing he could still hear her through their mysterious acoustic connection. "They're here." "I know," he replied, and she could hear something complicated in his voice. "How are you feeling?" It was such a simple question, but Victoria found herself struggling to answer. How was she feeling? 12 hours ago, she would have been ecstatic about rescue, desperate to return to her normal life, already planning how to minimize the professional damage her absence had caused. But now, the prospect of leaving this small space where she'd discovered so much about herself felt like emerging from a cocoon before her transformation was complete. "Scared," she admitted, speaking quietly so the rescue workers couldn't hear. "Not of being rescued, but of forgetting everything I've learned in here once I'm back in my regular life." "What are you most afraid of forgetting?" Victoria pressed, her back against the elevator wall, trying to hold on to the feeling of groundedness she'd found in the darkness. "I'm afraid I'll go back to being the person who was too busy to call her sister, too important to have real conversations, too scared to admit when she needs help." The sound of power tools started up outside the elevator, drowning out any possibility of quiet conversation. Victoria found herself grateful for the noise, which gave her time to think about what it would mean to return to the world as this new version of herself. She thought about her corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of the city skyline. Would she still feel the same pride in that view, or would it seem like a prison tower now? She thought about her calendar, packed with back-to-back meetings that left no time for reflection or genuine connection. Would she have the courage to change that schedule, or would she slip back into the familiar rhythm of constant motion? Most of all, she thought about David and Sophie. About the window their voices had opened into a completely different way of living. She'd experienced something in this elevator that she'd never had before. Unconditional acceptance, patient listening, the gift of being truly known by another person. How could she carry that feeling back into a world that seemed designed to prevent exactly that kind of connection? The power tools stopped, and Captain Rodriguez's voice came through again. "Ma'am, we're making good progress, but it's going to take another hour or so to get the doors open safely. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Victoria called back automatically, then caught herself. How many times had she given that response when it wasn't true? How many opportunities for genuine connection had she missed by reflexively claiming to be fine when she was actually struggling? "Actually," she said, louder this time, "I'm anxious about leaving. This has been a really important experience for me, and I'm worried about losing what I've gained here." There was a pause, and then Captain Rodriguez's voice came back, warmer. "Now, ma'am, that's more common than you might think. Sometimes when people go through intense experiences, even difficult ones, they worry about returning to normal life. But whatever you've learned about yourself in there, that's yours to keep." Victoria felt tears welling up at the unexpected kindness in his voice. Even in this brief interaction, she was experiencing something different than her usual professional exchanges. The captain had heard not just her words, but the emotion behind them, and he'd responded with genuine human compassion rather than just efficient problem-solving. "David," she said quietly, "did you hear that?" "I heard it," David replied. "He's right, you know. What you've discovered about yourself isn't going anywhere. It's part of you now. But what if I get caught up in all the demands and expectations and forget to access it?" "Then you'll remember again," David said simply. "Maybe not right away, but you'll remember. Because once you've experienced what it feels like to be truly yourself, it becomes harder to settle for anything less." Victoria hoped he was right, but she could already feel the pull of her old life starting to reassert itself. Her phone was dead, which meant she had no idea what crises might be waiting for her. The Japanese investors had probably left the country by now, taking their deal with them. Her assistant Julia was likely fielding angry calls from board members who couldn't understand where their CEO had disappeared to. "I should probably start thinking about damage control," Victoria said, half to herself. "Should you?" David asked gently. The question stopped Victoria short. Should she be thinking about damage control? Or was that just her old programming kicking in, the automatic assumption that her worth was tied to her professional performance and that any disruption to her productivity was a crisis to be managed? "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been operating on autopilot for so long that I'm not sure I know the difference between what I should do and what I think I'm supposed to do." What would someone who prioritized relationships over achievements do in this situation? Victoria considered the question, trying to imagine herself through this new lens. Someone who prioritized relationships would probably call her sister. First, to apologize for missing the rehearsal dinner and to make sure she could still make it to the wedding. She'd check on her team to make sure they were okay, not just to assess the business impact. She'd think about what really mattered instead of just what looked bad. That sounds like a good starting place. "But David," Victoria said, her voice small and uncertain, "what if I can't maintain this perspective once I'm back in that world? What if the pressure and the expectations and the sheer momentum of my old life pull me back into those patterns?" "Then you'll course correct," David said. "Change isn't a one-time event, Victoria. It's a series of choices you make every day. Some days you'll choose differently than others, and that's okay. The important thing is that you now know you have choices. The sound of the power tools resumed, closer now and more intense. Victoria could see sparks flickering around the edges of the elevator doors. Her rescue was imminent, and with it, the end of this strange and wonderful interlude outside of normal time. "David," she said urgently, needing to say something before it was too late, "I need you to know that talking with you has changed my life. Not just my perspective or my priorities, but my actual life. I'm not going to be the same person. When I walk out of here, I can hear it in your voice," David said warmly. "And Victoria, talking with you has changed my life too. You've reminded me that there are other people out there who are trying to live authentically, who are brave enough to question whether they're on the right path. That's not nothing. What will you do differently?" David was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could hear Sophie's voice in the background, probably getting ready for school. "I think I'll be more open to connection myself. I've been so focused on being a good father that I've forgotten I'm also allowed to be a whole person. Maybe it's time to remember that." Victoria felt something warm spread through her chest at the thought that their conversation had been transformative for both of them. She'd been so focused on what she was receiving from David that she hadn't fully considered what she might be giving in return. "Promise me something," she said impulsively. "What?" "Promise me that if you meet someone interesting, someone who makes you laugh or think or feel more like yourself, you won't let fear keep you from exploring that connection." "I promise," David said after a pause. "But only if you promise me something too. Anything. Promise me that you'll trust your instincts about what kind of life you want to build. Not what other people expect from you, not what looks successful from the outside, but what actually feels meaningful to you." "I promise," Victoria said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The elevator shuddered as the rescue team made their final adjustments to the doors. Victoria could hear multiple voices now, coordinating the complex operation of freeing her from her metal cocoon. "David," she said, panic rising in her voice, "I don't know how to say goodbye to you." "Then don't," he said simply. "This isn't goodbye, Victoria. This is the beginning." "The beginning of what?" "The beginning of you living the life you actually want instead of the life you think you should want. The beginning of you prioritizing connection over achievement. The beginning of you being brave enough to be vulnerable." The elevator doors groaned and began to part, letting in a flood of bright artificial light from the hallway. Victoria squinted against the glare, seeing the silhouettes of firefighters and paramedics waiting to help her out. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come toward us slowly," Captain Rodriguez called. "Watch your step." Victoria stood up from the bench where she'd spent the night, feeling stiff and disoriented after so many hours in the small space. But as she moved toward the open doors, she felt something else too, a sense of completion, as if she was emerging not just from an elevator, but from a chrysalis. "Victoria," David's voice came through one last time, fainter now as the acoustic connection weakened with the open doors. "Remember who you discovered yourself to be in there. That's the real you." "I'll remember," she whispered, stepping toward the light and the helping hands that reached out to guide her to safety. As the paramedics checked her vital signs and the firefighters began their debriefing, Victoria felt herself standing at a crossroads. To her left lay the familiar path of her old life, the meetings and deadlines and relentless pursuit of external validation. To her right lay something unknown but infinitely more appealing, a life built on authenticity and connection, and the courage to prioritize what actually mattered. She thought about Emma's wedding, about the opportunity to show up as a real sister, instead of just a successful one. She thought about her team at work, about the possibility of leading with compassion instead of just demanding results. She thought about David and Sophie, about the reminder that there were people in the world who prioritized love over achievement and somehow seemed happier for it. "Ma'am," one of the paramedics was saying, "we'd like to take you to the hospital. For observation, just as a precaution. Victoria almost agreed automatically, the way she always agreed to things that other people thought were best for her. But then she stopped, remembering her promise to David about trusting her own instincts. Actually, she said, I feel fine physically. What I really need right now is to call my sister and then get to Seattle for her wedding. The paramedic looked concerned. Ma'am, you've been through a traumatic experience. It would be wise to get checked out. I understand your concern, Victoria said gently but firmly, and I appreciate it. But I've been through something transformative, not just traumatic. And the most important thing I can do right now is show up for someone I love. As she spoke, Victoria realized that this was her first test of living differently. The old Victoria would have deferred to the experts, followed the recommended protocol, put health and safety procedures ahead of personal priorities. But the new Victoria understood that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to honor what your heart knows to be true. If you could just call me a cab, she said. I have a wedding to get to. The paramedic looked skeptical, but Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Emma, I think you know what you need right now. Let's get you that cab. As Victoria walked toward the elevator bank to descend to the lobby for the first time in almost 15 hours, she felt like she was stepping into a completely new life. The same building, the same hallways, the same marble floors, but everything felt different because she was different. She was no longer the woman who had entered that elevator yesterday afternoon, driven by deadlines and defined by achievements. She was someone new, someone who had learned to sit still, to listen deeply, to be vulnerable, to choose connection over control. The cab ride to the airport would give her time to plan how to show up differently in her life. The flight to Seattle would give her space to prepare for being the kind of sister Emma deserved. And the wedding itself would be her first opportunity to practice living from this new center of gravity she discovered in the darkness. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Victoria smiled for the second time in 24 hours. She was finally going somewhere she actually wanted to be, not just somewhere she was supposed to go. And that, she realized, made all the difference in the world. The beach in Seattle stretched endlessly under a canopy of silver clouds, waves rolling in with rhythmic persistence as Emma adjusted her veil for the third time in 10 minutes. Victoria stood behind her sister, carefully pinning the delicate fabric in place, marveling at how different this moment felt from what she had imagined during all those hurried phone calls about wedding logistics. Stop fidgeting, Victoria said softly, but there was warmth in her voice instead of impatience. You look absolutely radiant. Emma met her eyes in the mirror of the small beachside cottage that served as the bridal suite. I can't believe you made it. When Julia called yesterday to say you were missing, I thought. She trailed off, shaking her head. I know, Victoria said, placing her hands gently on Emma's shoulders. And I'm sorry. Not just for yesterday, but for all the times I wasn't really present, even when I was physically here. Emma turned around, studying her sister's face with the kind of attention that only siblings can give. Something's different about you. You seem quieter, more settled. Victoria smiled, thinking about David's voice in the darkness, about the 12 hours that had changed everything. I got stuck in an elevator for almost 15 hours. It gave me time to think about what really matters. And what matters? This, Victoria said simply, gesturing between them. You, family, being here for the people I love instead of just being successful at things that don't actually make me happy. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Carefully applied makeup be damned. I've missed you, Vic, the real you. I've missed my sister. They hugged then, carefully avoiding the dress and veil, and Victoria felt something click into place in her chest. This was what she had been missing all those years of climbing corporate ladders and chasing quarterly targets. This connection, this love, this feeling of belonging to something larger and more meaningful than market share. The ceremony took Place on a small stretch of private beach, with maybe 30 guests seated on white wooden chairs that faced the water. Victoria stood to Emma's left, holding her bouquet, watching her sister marry Marcus with the kind of joy that made the air itself seem to shimmer with possibility. When it came time for the maid of honor speech at the reception, Victoria stood up with a piece of paper in her hand. She'd written something on the plane, something about Emma's achievements and determination and ability to balance career success with personal happiness. But as she looked out at the faces of family and friends, at Emma glowing with contentment, at Marcus looking at his new wife like she was the answer to every question he'd ever had, Victoria folded the paper and put it away. "I had a speech prepared," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the small gathering. Something about Emma's impressive resume and her ability to excel at everything she touches. But yesterday, I learned something important about the difference between being impressive and being real. She looked directly at Emma, who was watching her with curious attention. "The truth is, Emma has always been the braver one between us. Not because she climbed mountains or started her own business or planned this beautiful wedding while working full-time. She's braver because she never forgot how to be herself. She never let success change who she was at her core." Victoria paused, feeling the weight of honesty in a way she rarely had before. "I spent years thinking that being a good sister meant being successful enough to reflect well on our family. But Emma taught me that being a good sister means showing up. Really showing up, not just physically, but emotionally. Not just for the big moments, but for the ordinary Tuesday conversations about nothing in particular." She raised her glass of champagne, looking around at the assembled guests. "So here's to Emma and Marcus, who chose love over convenience, who built a relationship based on who they really are instead of who they thought they should be. And here's to all of us remembering that the best things in life aren't achievements you can put on a resume. They're moments like this one, when you're surrounded by people who know your middle name and your favorite color and love you anyway." The applause was warm and genuine, and as Victoria sat down, Emma grabbed her hand and squeezed it tight. "That was perfect," Emma whispered. "That was my sister talking, not my successful sister, just my sister." Victoria squeezed back, feeling the truth of that distinction settle into her bones. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to filter away from the beach, Victoria found herself walking along the water's edge with her phone in her hand. She'd been putting off checking her messages all day, afraid of what crises might be waiting for her. But now, with the sound of waves providing a gentle soundtrack and the memory of David's voice still fresh in her mind, she felt ready to face whatever professional chaos her absence had created. There were 47 missed calls and 112 unread emails. The Japanese investors had indeed left the country, but not before expressing interest in rescheduling for the following month. Julia had handled most of the immediate crises with her usual competence. The board had been concerned, but not panicked. The world, it seemed, had continued to turn without Victoria's constant oversight. As she scrolled through the messages, Victoria felt something she hadn't expected, relief mixed with a strange kind of disappointment. She'd been so convinced that her constant availability was essential, that her relentless work ethic was the only thing standing between her company and disaster. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Her team was more capable than she'd given them credit for. Her systems were more robust than she'd assumed. Her indispensability had been, at least partially, an illusion she'd maintained to justify her workaholic tendencies. "Victoria," Emma's voice came from behind her. She'd changed out of her wedding dress and into jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You okay?" "I'm perfect," Victoria said, and realized she meant it in a way she rarely had before. "Just checking in with the office." "On my wedding day?" Emma asked, but there was teasing in her voice rather than hurt. "For the last time," Victoria said firmly, closing her phone and slipping it into her pocket. I'm making some changes, Em. Big ones. What kind of changes? Victoria looked out at the waves, thinking about how to explain the magnitude of her transformation to someone who hadn't experienced it firsthand. I'm going to learn how to have a life instead of just a career, she said finally. I'm going to figure out how to be successful without being miserable. I'm going to make time for the things that actually matter instead of just the things that feel urgent. Emma studied her sister's profile in the moonlight. This elevator experience really affected you, didn't it? It saved me, Victoria said simply. I was drowning in my own life, and I didn't even realize it. I thought I was swimming towards something important, but I was actually just treading water in deeper and deeper isolation. What happened in there, really? Victoria considered how much to share about David, about the conversation that had lasted through the night and into the dawn. How could she explain that a stranger's voice had become her lifeline, that 12 hours of honest conversation had taught her more about herself than years of therapy or self-help books ever had? I talked to someone, she said carefully. Someone who helped me remember who I used to be before I got so focused on who I thought I should become. What were you like before? Victoria smiled, remembering the girl who had wanted to be a librarian, who had believed in helping people find what they were looking for. I was curious about people instead of trying to manage them. I asked questions because I wanted to know the answers, not because I was setting up some strategic advantage. I had time for long conversations about ideas and dreams and what makes life meaningful. You can still be that person, Emma said gently. I know, Victoria replied, and I'm going to be. Starting now. They walked in comfortable silence. For a while, the waves washing over their bare feet as they moved along the shoreline. Victoria felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what mattered most. She said suddenly, what if I moved out here to Seattle? Emma stopped walking and turned to face her sister fully. Are you serious? I think I am, Victoria said, the idea crystallizing as she spoke it aloud. I could open a West Coast office, or work remotely, or even start something completely new. Something that uses my business skills but feels more meaningful than just maximizing shareholder value. What would you start? Victoria thought about her conversation with David about meaningful work and helping people and making a positive difference in the world. Maybe something that helps other women transition their careers without sacrificing their humanity. Maybe programs that teach companies how to create workplaces where people can be successful without being miserable. Maybe I'd even go back to school, study something I'm passionate about instead of just something that's profitable. That sounds amazing, Emma said, excitement building in her voice. And Marcus knows people in the nonprofit sector here, people who are doing exactly the kind of work you're describing. Really? Really? Victoria, you could build something beautiful here, something that matters. As they turned to walk back toward the reception venue, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. Not anxiety about meeting expectations or fear about falling behind, but authentic enthusiasm for the possibilities that lay ahead. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Victoria almost ignored it entirely. But something made her check, and when she saw the message, her heart stopped. It was from an unknown number, but the words were unmistakably familiar. I hope Emma's wedding was everything it should have been. I hope you remembered who you discovered yourself to be. David. Victoria stared at the screen, wondering how he'd gotten her number, how he'd known she needed to hear exactly those words at exactly this moment. But then she realized it didn't matter how. What mattered was that their connection had been real, that the transformation she'd experienced was real, that the choice to live differently was hers to make every single day. She typed back quickly, the wedding was perfect, and I'm choosing to live differently every day. Thank you for helping me find my way home to myself. Give Sophie a hug from her elevator friend. The response came almost immediately. She says to tell you that 7 times 8 still doesn't make sense, but she's willing to accept it as one of life's mysteries. Victoria laughed out loud, the sound carrying across the beach like a bell. Emma looked at her questioningly. Just a friend, Victoria said, slipping her phone back into her pocket. Someone who helped me remember that the most important conversations happen when you're not trying to impress anyone. Sounds like a good friend. The best kind, Victoria agreed. As they rejoined the wedding reception, Victoria felt herself settling into a new rhythm, a new way of being in the world. She danced with elderly relatives instead of checking email in the bathroom. She had long conversations with Emma's friends about their art projects and travel dreams and children's funny sayings. She helped clean up afterward, carrying chairs and folding tablecloths like any other family member instead of treating herself as too important for mundane tasks. And when she finally returned to her hotel room that night, exhausted but genuinely happy, Victoria made a list on hotel stationery. Not a to-do list or a strategic plan, but a simple accounting of what she wanted her life to look like going forward. Time for relationships that matter. Work that feels meaningful. A home where she could see trees from the window. Long conversations about ideas and dreams. Space for creativity and growth, and the kind of rest that restores the soul instead of just the body. As she fell asleep that night, Victoria thought about David and Sophie, getting ready for another ordinary morning in their apartment next to the office building where she'd been trapped. She thought about the acoustic miracle that had connected them across the space between buildings, between worlds, between one way of living and another. She'd entered that elevator as a woman who was successful but empty, accomplished but isolated, impressive but unknown even to herself. She'd emerged as someone who understood that true success meant building a life you actually wanted to live. That real strength came from vulnerability, that the most important achievements couldn't be measured in stock options or corner offices. The elevator had been her chrysalis. David's voice had been her guide. And now she was ready to spread wings she'd forgotten she had. The life she'd been living was ending, but the life she was meant to live was just beginning. And somewhere across the country, in a small apartment where a widowed father was making breakfast for his 7-year-old daughter, Victoria knew that another person was starting his day a little differently too, a little more open to the possibility that connection could happen anywhere, that love could find you when you least expected it, that sometimes the most important conversations began with a stranger's voice in the darkness. The elevator had trapped them both, in different ways, for different reasons. But in the end, it had set them both free. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the coffee shop on 5th Street, waiting for her latte and watching the morning rush through windows that revealed Mount Rainier in the distance. The Seattle drizzle painted everything in soft grays and greens, a palette that had become as familiar to her as the harsh glass and steel of her former city life. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant Marcus, not the Marcus who had married Emma, but a young man she'd hired specifically because he believed work should enhance life rather than consume it. The message was brief. The foundation. Meeting went well. They're interested in funding the pilot program. Also, Sophie Martinez called about the mentorship interview. Victoria smiled at the mention of Sophie, though not the Sophie she thought about most often. This Sophie was a recent business school graduate who wanted to learn how to build a successful career without sacrificing her mental health. It was exactly the kind of conversation Victoria had been having more and more frequently since launching. Her consulting practice focused on sustainable success and workplace wellness. The barista called her name, and as Victoria reached for her coffee, she noticed the woman behind her fumbling with her phone, clearly frustrated by something on the screen. The woman looked exhausted, her expensive suit wrinkled, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Excuse me," Victoria said gently. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, startled. "Oh yes, I'm fine. Just work stuff. Conference call in 5 minutes and I can't get this app to cooperate." Victoria recognized the particular brand of exhaustion in the woman's voice, the edge of desperation that came from trying to manage too much with too little support. "What kind of app are you trying to use?" "Video conferencing. I'm supposed to be presenting quarterly projections to investors from 3 different time zones. And of course the technology decides to fail at the worst possible moment. May I?" Victoria gestured toward the phone, and the woman handed it over gratefully. It took Victoria less than 30 seconds to identify and fix the connectivity issue. As she handed the phone back, she noticed the relief flooding the woman's face. "Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if I'd missed this meeting." "What would have happened if you had missed it?" Victoria asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. The woman looked confused by the question. I suppose the world wouldn't have ended. But my boss would have been furious, and the investors would have thought I was unprofessional, and you would have rescheduled for a time when the technology was working properly," Victoria finished gently. "Which might have resulted in a better presentation anyway." The woman stared at her for a moment, as if Victoria had spoken in a foreign language. "I never thought of it that way." Victoria handed the woman her business card. "I run workshops on sustainable leadership practices. If you're ever interested in exploring different ways to think about professional success, I'd love to talk with you." The woman took the card, studying it carefully. "Authentic Achievement Consulting," she read aloud. "What does that mean?" "It means helping people figure out how to be successful at work without sacrificing what makes them human," Victoria explained. "How to build careers that enhance their lives instead of consuming them." That sounds too good to be true. "It's not easy," Victoria admitted, "but it's possible. I know because I used to be exactly where you are right now." The woman's phone buzzed with a reminder about her meeting, and she glanced at it with visible anxiety. "Go," Victoria said warmly. "But if you ever want to talk about what it might look like to approach work differently, give me a call." As the woman hurried out of the coffee shop, Victoria felt the familiar satisfaction that came from planting seeds of possibility in someone else's consciousness. This was the work that energized her now, helping other people discover what she had learned in that elevator, that there were different ways to define success, different ways to show up in the world. Her own phone rang, and Victoria smiled when she saw Emma's name on the screen. "Hey, sister," she answered, stepping outside into the gentle rain. "Are you sitting down?" Emma's voice was bubbling with excitement. "I'm walking to my office, but I can sit if this is sitting down news." "It's definitely sitting down news. Are you ready?" Victoria found a bench under the awning of a bookstore and settled herself. "Okay, I'm sitting. What's going on?" "I'm pregnant." Victoria's face broke into a grin so wide that a passing stranger smiled in response. "Emma, that's incredible. How are you feeling? When are you due? Have you told Mom yet?" "Slow down," Emma laughed. "I'm feeling great. I'm due in February, and yes, I called Mom first, but you were a very close second." Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest at being included so immediately in this momentous news. A year ago, Emma might have waited days or weeks to share something this important, knowing that Victoria would be distracted by work concerns or too busy to properly celebrate. But their relationship had transformed along with everything else in Victoria's life. "I'm going to be an aunt," Victoria said wonderfully. "I'm going to spoil this baby absolutely rotten. You're going to be the cool aunt who teaches them about following their dreams instead of just following expectations," Emma said. "The one who shows them that there are lots of different ways to live a successful life." "I can't wait," Victoria said, meaning it completely. After she hung up with Emma, Victoria sat on the bench for a few more minutes, watching the city wake up around her. People hurried past with coffee cups and worried expressions, most of them looking like she used to look, successful on the surface but somehow hollow underneath. She thought about the elevator, about the 12 hours that had changed everything. It felt like a lifetime ago and also like yesterday. The woman she had been before that night seemed like a stranger now, someone Victoria remembered fondly but couldn't quite relate to anymore. Her consulting practice was thriving, but not in the aggressive, expansion-focused way her old career had grown. Instead, it was growing organically, through referrals from satisfied clients and word-of-mouth recommendations from people whose lives had genuinely improved as a result of working with her. She had enough income to live comfortably, enough meaningful work to feel engaged, and enough time for relationships and creativity, and the simple pleasure of watching mountains emerge from behind clouds. As she stood to continue her walk to the office, Victoria's phone chimed with a text message. When she saw the sender's name, her heart did a small skip. Sophie learned to ride a bike without training wheels yesterday. She wanted me to tell you that she's now accepting the mystery of 7 times 8 but has new questions about why adults have to work so much when there are so many interesting things to explore in the world. Victoria typed back quickly, "Tell her she's asking all the right questions. And congratulations to both of you on the bike milestone." The response came almost immediately. She says she's going to be a bike-riding marine biologist who only works on Tuesdays so she has time for other important things. Smart kid. She's got her priorities straight. She learned from a good teacher. How are you, Victoria? Victoria paused in her typing, considering how to answer that question honestly. How was she? She was different, fundamentally and irreversibly. Changed from the woman who had stepped into that elevator 15 months ago. She was happier, though her life was arguably less conventionally successful. She was more connected to other people, though her social circle was smaller and more intentional. She was more herself than she had been in years, though that self was still evolving and surprising her regularly. "I'm good," she wrote back. "Really good. Different than I used to be, but good different. I'm glad. Sophie and I think about you sometimes, especially when we're having conversations about what matters most in life. And what conclusions do you reach? That the people who care about you matter more than the people who are impressed by you. That being known is better than being admired. That sometimes the most important conversations happen with people you've never met." Victoria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, standing there on a Seattle sidewalk in the gentle rain. David had a gift for distilling complex truths into simple statements that somehow contained entire philosophies of living. "How are you?" she typed. "Both of you?" "We're good too." Sophie started 2nd grade and is convinced her teacher is a secret superhero because she knows everything about everything. "And I've been taking your advice about being open to connection." Victoria's heart rate picked up slightly. "Oh?" "I met someone, another parent at Sophie's school. She's a librarian, which made me think of you. We've been taking things slowly, but Sophie likes her, and she makes me laugh in ways I'd forgotten I could laugh." Victoria found herself smiling through her tears. "David, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. Sophie wants to know if you'll be our flower girl if we ever get married." Victoria laughed out loud, causing another passerby to look at her curiously. "Tell Sophie I would be honored to be her flower girl, but she'd have to teach me how to sprinkle petals properly. She says she'll give you lessons via video call if necessary." As Victoria reached her office building, a modest 3-story structure with a community garden out front instead of a corporate plaza, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the chain of events that had led her here. The elevator breakdown that had seemed like a crisis had actually been a gift, forcing her to slow down long enough to realize that the life she was living wasn't the life she wanted. Her office was on the 2nd floor, with windows that looked out over the garden and the neighborhood beyond. It was a far cry from the corner office with city views that she used to occupy, but it felt more like home than any workspace she'd ever had. Her assistant Marcus was already at his desk, coordinating the schedules for her 3 main programs: the executive coaching for sustainable leadership, the workshops on workplace wellness, and the mentorship program for young professionals who wanted to build meaningful careers without sacrificing their humanity. "Good morning, Victoria," he said cheerfully. "The foundation called to confirm funding for the pilot program, and you have 3 new coaching inquiries from yesterday's workshop. Also, there's someone here to see you." Victoria looked toward the small seating area near the windows and saw a familiar figure, the woman from the coffee shop, still in her expensive suit, but looking somehow more relaxed than she had that morning. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," the woman said, standing as Victoria approached. "I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation this morning. My name is Sarah Chen, and I think I need help." Victoria gestured toward the comfortable chairs by the window. "I'm glad you came, Sarah. Tell me what's going on." As Sarah began to share her story, Victoria recognized all the familiar themes: the relentless pressure to achieve, the fear of disappointing others, the growing sense that success and happiness were mutually exclusive. It was like looking at a version of her former self, and Victoria felt both compassion for Sarah's struggle and excitement about the possibility of helping her find a different path. "The thing is," Sarah was saying, "I used to love my work. I got into marketing because I believed in connecting people with products that could improve their lives. But somewhere along the way, it became just about numbers and market share and beating the competition. I can't remember the last time I felt proud of something I accomplished instead of just relieved that I didn't fail." "What would it look like if you could find your way back to that sense of purpose?" Victoria asked. "I don't know if that's possible," Sarah admitted. "I have responsibilities, obligations. I can't just abandon everything I've worked for." "I'm not suggesting you abandon anything," Victoria said gently. "I'm suggesting you might be able to transform it, to approach the same work from a different mindset, with different priorities, in a way that aligns with who you actually are instead of who you think you should be." They talked for over an hour, and by the time Sarah left, she had signed up for Victoria's next workshop series and scheduled a follow-up coaching session. As Victoria watched her walk away, she saw something different in Sarah's posture, a loosening of the rigid control that had been holding her so tightly. The rest of Victoria's day unfolded with the kind of rhythm she'd learned to create for herself: meaningful work punctuated by actual breaks, challenging conversations balanced with time for reflection, professional accomplishments woven together with personal connections. She had lunch with a former client who had become a friend, spent an hour planning curriculum for her upcoming workshop, and made time for a video call with Emma to discuss baby plans. As evening approached, Victoria packed up her things and prepared to head home to the small house she'd bought in a neighborhood full of families and dog walkers and corner cafes. It was a 10-minute walk from her office through tree-lined streets that reminded her daily that there was a world beyond corporate towers and quarterly reports. On her way out of the building, she stopped to check on the community garden, where several of her neighbors were tending to late-season vegetables and planning for next year's plantings. Victoria had never been much of a gardener, but she'd learned to appreciate the patience and faith required to plant something in the spring and trust that it would grow into something beautiful by fall. Victoria called Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had become Victoria's unofficial gardening mentor. "Come see how the tomatoes turned out." Victoria walked over to admire the heavy red fruit hanging from vines that had been tiny seedlings just a few months earlier. "They're beautiful, Mrs. Patterson. You have such a gift for this." "It's not a gift," the older woman said with a smile. "It's just patience and attention. Most things grow beautifully if you give them the right conditions. And don't try to rush the process." As Victoria walked home through the gentle Seattle evening, Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in her mind. Most things grow beautifully if you give them the right conditions and don't try to rush the process. It was true of tomatoes, and it was true of people, and it was true of the new life Victoria had been cultivating since that night in the elevator. She thought about David and Sophie, about the slow and patient way they'd built their connection with his new partner. She thought about Emma and Marcus, preparing to welcome new life into the world with excitement rather than anxiety. She thought about Sarah, beginning her own journey toward a more authentic version of success. All of them were growing, changing, becoming more themselves rather than less. And it was happening not through force or pressure or relentless striving, but through the revolutionary act of slowing down long enough to pay attention to what was actually happening, what was actually needed, what was actually true. When Victoria reached her front door, she paused to look back at the neighborhood settling into evening quiet. Lights were coming on in windows, families were gathering around dinner tables. Dogs were being walked by owners who stopped to chat with neighbors about ordinary, wonderful things. This was the life she had chosen, the life she had built from the ashes of her old existence. It wasn't the life that would impress her former colleagues or make headlines in business magazines. But it was a life that fit her, a life that felt like home, a life that allowed her to be fully herself while contributing something meaningful to the world. As she opened her door and stepped into the warm light of her own small sanctuary, Victoria felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you're meant to do, being exactly who you're meant to be. The elevator had been her chrysalis, but this daily choice to live authentically, to prioritize connection over achievement, to measure success by happiness rather than external metrics, this was her flight, and she was soaring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.